Good afternoon and welcome to Rhyme of the Times 2022. Review of the year 22, 12 months of chaos and plenty too. Part 1, Life in the UK. Act 1. The sky fell in with a chat with sky, gravity he could no longer defy, even allies and the wise couldn't answer the wise for Boris's lies, and the country sighed and people took sides. The party had to decide if Partygate would decide and the PM's demise, and finally, cut down to size, his premiership capsized. And though he tried, oh how he tried, he couldn't stop the slide and the end of his roller coaster ride. New Year's Day, and Tony Blair became a Sir, a Queen's honour that caused a considerable stir. Remembering the reasons for invading Iraq, many felt Tony should give his gong back. A tainted Prime Minister who caused upset? I'm afraid we hadn't seen nothing yet. Back in the days when Europe had peace, but intelligence said that peace may soon cease, and Western leaders were disputing and computing whether Putin was really about to put the boot in, Britain was beginning to understand the current political lie of the land. Maybe green and pleasant, but how was it lying? More specifically, why did our PM keep lying? Alarm bells chimed in the year's very first week, with Boris being uncharacteristically meek. He gave an apology, humble and sincere, to his ethics advisor for not being clear. Some phone texts he didn't straight away forward because he wasn't being exactly straightforward about the Downing Street flat upgrade and by whom the huge bill was being paid. Late 2021 had begun the Partygate sleaze, and now it was spreading like a viral disease. At last, in the Commons, an apology came, but for many the PM's words were too lame. They queued up to have the PM accused in a rowdy and feral PMQs, and while his weasel words were dissected, his own party was becoming disaffected. Then came allegations of two parties on the eve of the day that the whole of the country had grieved. In April 2021 the Queen mourned in isolation as the funeral of Philip shown to the nation. Meanwhile, Downing Street had been clearing up the mess of a long night of fun and boozy excess, but all Johnson and his pals could say, wait for the findings of Dame Susan Gray. Each new day there were new allegations of Boris apparently breaking regulations. Then it seemed he may have lost it all with a chance encounter in a hospital. He appeared to think it was a friendly chin wag. But Sky News' Beth Rigby went nag, nag, nag. After about 20 minutes or so, Boris had been shamed with no place to go. Finchley Hospital he may forever be ruining, the scene of the start of his undoing. The place where on television he stated he didn't know the rules that he himself had created. He'd only just launched his operation Save Big Dog. Big Dog now seemed hanged and he was hanged dog. Beth's cutting questions were for Boris like a knife. Rumours of his imminent demise were now rife. But in PMQs the very next day, it appeared this dog would still have his day. Starmer initially like a dog with a bone, by the end his questioning began to drone. So the PM may have actually won this fight, this dog fight, defending by attacking. And this was despite the first defection to Labour for 15 years. Christian Wakeford crossed the floor to cheers and jeers. It happened just before PMQs had begun. Near the end, the Commons was once again stunned. David Davis landed what seemed a telling blow. The Tory grandee told Boris, in God's name go. But Boris continued to roll with the punches. Cabinet unrest proved little more than hunches. He even managed to not lose his rag when a Tory rebel called William Ragg said he was reporting to the Met that Tory whips were using threats Blackmail, he claimed, had been applied to ensure the Conservatives stayed on side. If Ragg wanted to trigger Johnson's downfall, he didn't get what he wanted at all. The rumoured letters of no confidence were ripped up in the name of party providence. The saga went on. There seemed no break in the incidence of COVID guideline breaks. Soon came another entry for Partygate, a gathering for a birthday to celebrate. The PM couldn't say he wasn't present. He was the one receiving the presents. At a time when the country was forbidden to mix, Boris had had a Beano for his 56th. Carrie, it seems, had arranged it impromptu. Friends, colleagues and a cake. What was Boris to do? June 2020, it seemed he'd had his cake and ate it, ignoring the rules that he'd made but hated. And then there was a gathering hosted by the PM, a Dominic Cummings party cum requiem. Boris thought his advisor thought he was all that, so he marked Cummings going with a rave up in his flat. And then the Met also got involved. Cressida Dick thought there may be some crimes to solve. This turned out to be to Johnson's advantage, a temporary reprieve from his self-made carnage. Because the police expressed a preference that Sue Gray should minimise any reference to any of the alleged gatherings on which police were evidence gathering. It turned out that Sue Gray had given the police information and details about 12 parties. To avoid any prejudice, the Met now thought these 12 should not form part of her report. Gray's redacted report arrived as January ended. Surely Johnson's position could not be defended. Many thought the PM's cause was now lost as he came to the Commons to give his riposte. It wasn't the full report and was just 12 pages long, but the conclusions were still damning and strong. A failure in leadership, a drinking culture. His opponents were already circling like vultures. Johnson's apology was brief, for most too light, the overall tone more brash than contrite, and soon he was back to trademark cavalier, attacking Labour and Captain Hindsight Sakir. The Speaker had trouble having tempers doused, ended up throwing Ian Blackford out of the House. The SNP firebrand said the PM was a liar. Lindsay Hoyle tried but failed to extinguish his fire, and things looked like they might really unravel when Johnson implied Starmer helped shield Jimmy Savile. 2 days later for PMQs, the House was calmer, with more politesse between Johnson and Starmer. Chill pills seemingly taken, less vicious attacks, although on Savile Boris didn't backtrack. The Tory letters of no confidence winging their way to the 1922 committee chair every day. Rivals maybe thought it's just a matter of time before they conclude this PM pantomime. By the end of the week, five close aides jumped ship, unimpressed with the state of his leadership. Munira Mirza, for 14 years a close ally, said the Savile comments were too close to a lie. Without it being retracted, she said there's no excuse making dubious claims concerning child abuse. Most Tories at this point still preferred the status quo. Down, Johnson may have been, but he still shouldn't go. And the PM himself seemed quite undeterred, as if Partygate had never occurred. Then a by-election win in Southend West, but this brought only a hollow success. Respectfully, the main parties didn't contest the former seat of the murdered David MS. The next week, events turned more sinister. A rabble gathered on the streets of Westminster. Keir Starmer and David Lammy faced the angry mob, conspiracy theorists, anti-vaxxers, thugs and yobs. Fortunately, a police escort was on hand to usher the politicians into a van, but this couple of shadow cabinet MPs were a bit roughed up and not best pleased. The mob was shouting, crazed and random. It was hard to really understand them. There was one clear yell from one agitator, calling out the Labour leader to be a traitor. Then the dodgy blonde guy's name was heard. No, not Johnson, that paedophilic turd. The link to the PM's previous Commons tirade, evidently for some, is one easily made. The half which listened to his words and then see an invitation to a far-right feeding frenzy. But just like Trump with the capital insurrection, Boris denied there was any such connection. But his own party were now starting to cringe at their leader energising the lunatic fringe, and the PM with his lunatic trim still wouldn't let the flax stick on him. The question was, would the Tories stick with him? His chances of survival were becoming fat or slim. Things had taken a dangerous direction of travel since the introduction of the name Jimmy Savile, and then the other one with the messy blonde hair handed the police his party questionnaire. He'd answered the Met's questions about the parties, no doubt in language as colourful as Smarties. Then suddenly everyone's focus was diverted. War in Ukraine had us all disconcerted. Could an unwarranted foreign invasion have a prime minister, save a prime minister and unite our nation? There was a precedent from 40 years before with Margaret Thatcher and the Falklands War, but Partygate was a saga that just kept on giving, and for Mr. Johnson it was quite unforgiving. And he didn't help himself at the Tory Spring Conference when he made a controversial inference. He compared Brexit with the Ukrainian war, a fight for freedom from a big bully next door. Insensitive, crass, for Ukraine an insult. Johnson's speech received the expected result. And in April things were still not going fine as he, his wife and Rishi paid their fines. There followed another Commons Groundhog Day. Once again we would hear what Boris had to say. Up to now we'd had a fairly tin-eared PM, but he couldn't deny things now with an FPN. Despite lots of sorries topped with contrition and no shortage of naughty boy admissions, even his allies were starting to wobble. 2 days later the PM was again nobbled. While he flew to India for some trade dealing, in the Commons MPs again vented feelings. In his absence, ex-Brexit Minister Steve Baker, who is known to be a Tory mover and shaker, said the gig's up, Boris should be long gone for his litany of COVID R&R wrongs. So the Tory whips reassessed their hand, knowing a confidence vote may not go as planned. Even though 2 days prior he'd apologised, Labour tabled a motion to have him scrutinised for all the parties and other assertions, and then telling the House his own dubious versions. They felt his recollections were a bit water-mitty, so wanted the PM to face a committee. The Privileges Committee is cross-party. Conservatives were now a very cross-party. By voting for an amendment to wait for Sue Gray, they thought Labour's motion could be delayed, but then it seemed not enough Tories would agree, heaping on the PM more ignominy. So while his Delhi trip should have been about trade, questions about Partygate had him waylaid. The narrative needed changing to take the attention. What was this? A godsend intervention? Durham police decided they should investigate what could have been Starmer's own Partygate. Labour's leader was caught with curry and beer, close to colleagues in a room in lockdown last year. At a time when no one should congregate, the media and Tories dubbed it Beergate. But it never quite gained the same traction that Partygate did with its public reaction. Forget Beergate, Labour tried to propagate. That Partygate is the only real improper gate. Beergate was small beer compared to Partygate. Also Keir didn't make the rules and then obfuscate. Indeed, he now put his neck on the line, saying he would resign if he was handed a fine. The next week there was a special panorama on Partygate and Johnson and Beergate and Starmer. Next day, Sue Gray's full report was unveiled, saying how the senior leadership had failed. Could this be when the PM would be finally sacked? When the disenchanted Tories would finally act? Up to now we'd only had Sue's interim, armed with the full version they laid into him. Because what the unredacted version had thrown up was vomit and adults not acting grown up. Strangely, though, public opinion wasn't moving. Those who disapproved were still disapproving. Those who didn't care right from the start generally still had no major change of heart. The problem that Tories continued to face was that the dial from the start had been in the wrong place. And as the week closed, more trouble for Boris. Out of the woods, maybe into a forest. Downing Street faced allegations they refuted, that they'd tried to have Grey's dossier diluted. The Queen's Platinum parties offered temporary reprieve, but couldn't stop Tories wanting Boris to leave. All week at Westminster there was drip, 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 as Tories gave their thumbs down to their leadership. Boris backers needed him to quickly style up as letters to Grey and Brady began to pile up. The tipping point for many had finally been reached with Grey's confirmation of rules being breached. June's first Sunday was the last party for the Queen, and the party was over for Boris, it seemed. The next day reality struck home for the PM. Grey and Brady made an announcement around 8 a.m. The threshold of 54 letters had been crossed from Tories whose confidence in the PM was lost. So the chair of the 22 committee conceded a secret ballot was now what was needed. And Conservatives generally don't mess about. Just 12 hours to decide if Boris should be out. All-day briefings from both sides, last ditch, and at 4 p.m. the Prime Minister's last pitch. As Johnson entered the 22 committee room, it must have seemed more like the last chance saloon. For 27 minutes he set out his vision, presenting his party with a tough decision. The 22 committee room was indeed a place where the Tories had a catch-22 to face. Should they dump Boris and be left to choose a leader likely to be an election loser, or give a last chance to their PM and pray that his charisma wins through again? 211 to 148. A victory for Boris, but not all that great. Although the party was clearly conflicted, most agreed their problems were self-inflicted. If only the leader could change his behaviour, he could still be their party's ultimate saviour. But 41% thought he'd run out of lives. From here it would take a miracle to survive. Party Raw said that he was now safe for a year. And that was on paper. Reality was less clear. Somehow Boris had lived to fight another day, though he had less support than there'd been for Mrs May in 2018 when she won Tory approval, only for 5 months later to suffer her removal. However, her dog's Brexit had suited no one's palate, and she'd fluffed the 2018 national ballot. Boris could still turn to his landslide win, but May didn't lose 4 by-elections on the spin. But compared to May, he's a different beast, and he'd say that he got Brexit done at least. So Conservative discontent rumbled on as the PM mumbled and stumbled on. Next, it was his ethics adviser, Lord Guyte, who concluded that it was ethically right to leave his post with immediate effect for his own conscience and self-respect. He left without fuss, hardly a word from his gob. The only way is ethics for those in such jobs. Lord only knows how the PM viewed the news, silly old Guyte or some other such abuse. Whether or not Boris thought him a git, he was the third such aide in 18 months to quit. One ethics adviser gone could be just careless. Losing 3 suggested Boris didn't care less. In a letter next day about his decision, Guyte said he'd been put in an odious position. The PM now wanted no adviser at all, which some might call an unethical call. The next general election date's not coming soon. Too soon for Tories, though, after the events of late June. Going by how the 2 by-elections had been, Tories could say bye-bye to any election win. First a rude Wakefield wake-up call, but Tiverton and Honiton was a greater fall. 2 Tory own goals, because there'd been no need for these by-elections but for their own misdeeds. Ahmed Khan guilty of sexual assault. Neil Parish viewed porn in the Commons and was caught. Wakefield was a red wall Labour seat taken back. The Devon loss had Tories more taken aback. There was a 30% swing to Lib Dem Richard Ford in winning. He achieved 2 major records. The first time ever the Tories had lost that seat, and the biggest lead ever to be turned into defeat. 24,329 had been Mr. Parish's majority last time. Next day, Tory co-chair Oliver Dowden viewed the wreckage and must have thought, now then, I'd rather be outside than silently grumble. Oliver couldn't take any more of Mr. Bumble. So, before facing media indignation, he submitted a letter of resignation in which he suggested a need for humility and someone taking responsibility. That someone he didn't actually name, most pointed to the top to apportion blame. These by-elections took place with Boris at Chogham. Press questions dogged him. He tried to dodge them. He ploughed on with the mantra, business as usual. Will you quit, PM? Drew a blunt refusal. Overall, his trip to Rwanda was fair, better than for the migrants he wanted sent there. And on that issue, some friction in Kigali with the Queen represented by Prince Charlie. The Queen's son had apparently been heard calling the government's Rwanda migrant plan appalling. But Charles and Boris kept their peace. Commonwealth leaders observed no unease. And as the UK faced approaching record heat, the temperature rose further in Downing Street. The Prime Minister, who's like Marmite for most, was about to become Marmite on toast. As July entered, more Tory party déjà vu. We had to pinch ourselves. Was this really true? Chris Pincher, the Tamworth Tory MP, sexually assaulted two men, allegedly. It happened in a private members' club 2 nights before. But here's the rub. Mr. Pincher was the Deputy Chief Whip, supposed to ensure standards and discipline don't slip. And although he resigned and appeared to reflect, it seemed the charges he didn't fully accept. He blamed his behaviour on too much drink. His quick resignation made many think. Was he hoping contrition would get him off the hook, and for Boris make it a slightly better look? Whatever the plan didn't achieve its aim. Boris found himself in a pickle again. And not long afterwards stories did abound that the PM's judgment had again been unsound. When he promoted Pincher to his position, he already knew of his iffy disposition. As Johnson's responses about Pincher got odder, his answers provided more opponents with fodder. And this was the fatal political rumpus, casting more doubt on his moral compass. That led to the final dramatic denouement for this most opinion-divided human. And as evenings drew near, on July the 5th, 2 big hitters resigned from the cabinet forthwith. Health Secretary Sajid Javid, the first to resign. The Chancellor Rishi Sunak then also called time. In 10 crazy minutes, the 2 men had quit. The drip soon turned into a flood of exits. And as the departures came, so did the panic. Ministers like deck chairs on the Titanic, being rearranged or actually replaced by a PM who was rapidly losing face. In PMQ, Starmer referred to the nodding dogs, the front bench loyalists like your Jacob Rees-Moggs, alongside Truss, Raab, Coffey and Dorries. But for those that fled, he felt more sorry. They were right to flee. They represented those that were the sinking ship that was leaving the rat. As the sun rose that Thursday morning, the light on the PM still wasn't dawning. He thought 59 resignations was a mere flesh wound, not evidence that he'd lost the dressing room. Michelle Donnellan was given the education brief, but her tenure was record-breakingly brief. After 36 hours, she made the decision that she'd been put in an impossible position. As Boris fought to keep his cabinet intact, he still found room to have Michael Gove sacked. Then Zahawi, the Chancellor, for barely a day, effectively told Boris he should no longer stay. That was one of so many final straws that finally coaxed Boris through the number 10 doors. On July the 7th, as the sun shone overhead, Boris was out, but not down. As he said, few words of regret. No sign of contrition. This wasn't actually his desired decision. He'd been forced out by the instinct of the herd, perhaps a nod to the dissent that he'd heard, the dissent that led to his descent from grace, ignoring all the allegations he'd faced. "Them's the breaks," he said with some whimsy. By his standards this speech was short and flimsy. By giving no word of an actual resignation, he caused some consternation to a concerned nation. 2 weeks later he brought down his final curtain, but left his future plans still uncertain. In PMQs this was his last appearance, maybe. He signed off with the words, "Hasta la vista, baby." While Keir ripped to shreds Boris's premiership, from both sides there were the usual banter and quips. "A great pointless human bollard," one of Johnson's, as he described Keir with typical flamboyant nonsense. So Boris left behind a house full of drama and a relieved or perhaps a concerned Keir Starmer. Much as Keir loathed him, the PM's behaviour had of late made him a big asset for Labour. So Boris had eventually given up the ghost, though for 6 long weeks he stayed in his post. And all summer his allies railed and cussed, but Johnson was gone. It was now Sunak or Truss.